Thanks, Glenn. And I too want to thank you for being here, and not just those who are listening to my very loud voice in this auditorium, but those who are watching this class or listening at another time. The full-time students, I mean, you've been going about 3 months now, and I'm doing my best to not be too simple, because you've done a lot of reading, you've done writing, you've done papers, and so forth, but a little review is good. And for those who are just dropping in to see what's going on, I'll try my best to be aware and sensitive and to incorporate everyone in the discussion. But it's really good to be here. And this was our plan yesterday. If you weren't, we, after a quiz, which was inspiring and humbling, depending on how you did, we had really just studied Jesus, looking at 5 different kinds of messianic prophecy, 5 different categories of prophecy, and we looked at the Trinity and suggested that most evangelicals' take on the Trinity is incorrect because the Son is not subordinated to the Father, which creates an interesting anomaly. In church history, the view of the Trinity changed from the 4th century on. And then we had some general questions. Last night, as Glenn mentioned, I spoke at a chapter of Reasonable Faith. They have 74 chapters in the U.S. and other countries. I met the Denver chapter leader at an archaeological tour earlier this year. He said, wow, I wish you could come to Denver. I said, well, I'm coming to Denver. So we worked it out. And I know that this isn't really in the program. I'm not planning to reteach what I did last night, but I thought it might be, if you're just wondering, if you weren't there, about 15 of us were there, which was really cool. But I thought maybe I'd just show you what we looked at last night, just see the kind of presentation it was. Would that be okay? Yes. That might take me 5 or 10 minutes, but you're kind of warming up anyway. The assignment was to speak on cultural apologetics. And you'd think, isn't all apologetic cultural in some sense? I guess so. But there's a kind of what we call classical apologetics. I'll skip through. I was just explaining how my ministry worked and so forth. What is cultural apologetics? Then we looked at conversation topics, and then we had an extended time of questions, well over an hour. Classical apologetics, okay, here are 4 reasons that I think there's a God, or here are 3 airtight reasons and 3 plausible arguments. What do you say? Here's the evidence. Choose. The trustworthiness of the Bible. Okay, we'll have a class on the accurate copying. We'll have a class on the practical application. We'll have a class on the inspiration. And, okay, it's God's Word. Are you going to resist, yes or no? The classical apologetics, or even in what I call the quadrilemma, Jesus, was he legend, liar, lunatic, or Lord? It's very logical. A lot of people prefer that. But it's quite different to cultural apologetics, which is the kind of stuff that Schaeffer did in the 60s, 70s. Zacharias does right now. A lot of people like him. He can really tell a great story. He's logical, but he meets us at a phrase he uses a lot, is the kitchen table. What are the kinds of things you'd be talking about with your friends or your family? It might be keying off something in the news. Oh, there was a murder last night. Oh, there was a beheading of a journalist. What do you think about that? Or, oh, that protest, 100,000 people protesting for extra toilets, or whatever the thing is. But our culture, and it's different in every world, in each culture, in each subculture, but our world gives us all kinds of opportunities to connect. And Paul models this really well by being familiar with the philosophers and the playwrights, the culture, the language of the Greeks. So when he's in Athens, it's masterful. Now he does the same thing in other parts of Acts. And to an extent in the letters, every time I go to that city, I like to teach from Acts 17, usually preach from it, because I think of my first time in Athens, 1980, I was all alone for a number of days, a week actually, and I wandered around and I was amazed, and I shared my faith with people, and it's imprinted deep in my memory. See, I'm telling a story, which is different than giving reasons. Then to understand cultural apologetics today in our society, you've got to know what postmodernism is. It's the kind of de facto philosophy of the day. It may be more of a movement or a mood or a methodology. It's a reaction against the overly optimistic hope in science and progress. The 19th century made it look like we're going to do great. But if everything's reducible to an equation and we still end up having world wars and 169 people being killed through atheistic regimes last century, maybe there's a better way. And so postmodernists are skeptical of authority, and especially of truth claims. We talked about postmodernism, how that works, some of the different areas, why it's important, because Paul says he doesn't want us to be captivated by empty deceit, by the wrong kind of philosophy, by plausible arguments, and I think there's no doubt that that warning is still valid today. Many Christians believe all kinds of things, not because they got there by reason. They absorbed it through the television, something they heard in a youth ministry talk, something they just thought of themselves. And in our society, although the truth claims, analyzing truth is vital. We've got to do that. That's not really an option. The question a lot of the current generation ask is not, is it true? I mean, you can prove it's true. They say, okay, so what? Or they'll say, but that's your truth. It's not my truth. So they get all slippery and relativistic on you. Often they're more interested in, well, does it work? Or does this make my life better? Now, we're not watering down the gospel to the level of, what is appealing, but we've got to be realistic. In modern world, in Western culture, right? Most of Europe and North America especially, people want to know, does it work? We have this beautiful dog. I told you about our puppy. She doesn't really ponder the deep issues of life. She doesn't examine the supply chain of the dog food we provide her. She just wants to know, can I eat it? And if it's not food, she still wants to know, can I put it in my mouth? Because she's a puppy. That's not to compare people to dogs, but there is a comparison. So the way I thought I'd approach it after the intro was give like 10 different things you can talk about that aren't threatening. It's not, do you have a moment to talk about the teleological argument for God's existence? Not that approach, but more, how you doing? Anything interesting happened this weekend? Just a normal conversation that leads into something that can be apologetically useful. Now, a lot of this material, I'll fly through it. A lot of this is at my website. So one of those things is death. Everyone wants to talk about death. A lot of people, you can ask them, what do you think's on the other side? They won't necessarily even take that as a religious question. They'll talk about it. It's a great thing. Talk about world religion. Talk about the differences, the similarities. Spirituality. What do you think of Oprah Winfrey, that author she had, The Secret, the one who said that she thinks we're God, and if we understand that, reality will bend itself, and we get whatever we want? What do you think about that? Talking about something on Oprah, I've never watched an Oprah show myself, but talking about something on Oprah is easy and pretty non-threatening for like 99% of everyone, right? But you can see how it's just a slight jump over. Do you really think you can change reality just by believing? Some religious people think they can change reality. I don't mean by praying. That's a different kind of change. But I mean people think they can change reality so they can get whatever they want, like those health and wealth preachers. Science. All cool things from the doctrine of the two books all the way to exobiology. We'll have a class on that tomorrow morning. And when I told them when I was last time I was in Singapore, I was doing a series on church history, and we had a gap in the schedule. And they said, teach us about 20th century science. It was the favorite, particularly for all the youth there, for a couple of hundred teens who were there. Ecology is cool, because the Bible's got ecology, right? Environment, issues of our relationship to nature. You can't be part of nature and above nature and make inconsistent claims, because they'll say, just do what's natural, and that's why I recycle. Well, doing what's natural would not be to recycle, be just to leave the thing on the ground. I mean, the lions don't hold hands and police the campsite after they've finished their dinner. You've got a sickly child and a healthy child. You don't just roll over and crush the number 2 panda cub. You let both your children live. I mean, what's done in nature is not really the model for us. Now, natural can be good, but I think as Christians we're called to live above the natural level. Isn't that the level of the flesh anyway? Sex, that's a good thing to bring up. It's in the Bible. What about virginity, homosexuality? How would Jesus respond? Gender issues and so forth. God, is he really mean-spirited? the paranormal. I shared about an invitation I had to University of Alaska to speak on that topic. A lot of people don't believe in God, but they believe in green people from outer space. Back in, okay, let's go to Europe 500 years ago. What did people believe in 500 years ago? That'd be just before the Reformation. Yeah, could say it a bit louder. Demons? What else? The Pope, yeah, of course. Depends on the country. Goblins, leprechauns, pixies. Now, today, if you told your friend, yeah, you know, I believe in pixies. He'd say, I believe in fairies. And fairies? You mean boats? Or you mean people who aren't straight? What do you, if you said fairies, you wouldn't be respected. But you can believe that your Aunt Zelda was abducted by aliens. You can think, you know, they're here, Area 51, you know. I live 1,000 feet from Roswell, Georgia, not Roswell, New Mexico. People believe in that stuff. And not only that, they're fascinated. Topics like vampires. I mean, these things go in cycles. Today's vampire is very handsome, but the truth is he's the dark Christ. I started thinking about the comparisons between the vampire and Jesus. They are like opposite in like 12 or 13 pretty obvious ways. You know, like one gives his blood for you, the other takes your blood for him, right? All these contrasts, and that's a cool presentation. Werewolves, mummies, ghosts, these are all podcasts I do. Zombies, which is an exploration in what is alive. What does it mean to be alive? What does it mean to look like you're alive but you're not? You know, what should we do in these extreme circumstances? The conspiracies, the kinds of ideas popularized by Dan Brown and Da Vinci Code, the so-called missing gospels, the forbidden books of the Bible that I taught in Mexico last week, the manuscript of Jesus' wife, the Dead Sea Scrolls. You know it's conspiracy. Conspiracy? They've been all translated for 25 years. What conspiracy are you referring to? It doesn't really matter. It's the idea of it that's fun. And so we love that. And then I had the 10th area was etc. And then we had a conclusion. We need to do better. Modern generation is all about journey. The truth is, journey's good, John 10:10. But how about destination? You know, otherwise we're not really helping people. And so I gave a kind of a fourfold challenge, and it was great. We had lots and lots of questions. So I just want to let you know what was going on. It's certainly very different than our very considered study of Messianic prophecy. You guys okay? Hope I didn't waste too much of the time. I did use a bit, but you'll forgive me. Okay, so that was last night. Did anyone in this room get too much sleep yesterday? If you've got any reserve, could you please slip it to me in the break? I would really, really appreciate that. Okay, so now, what happened there? A time warp of some kind, obviously. But anyway, you can see where we are. Today, contradictions, inerrancies, which is really kind of like a part 2 of that. Then we're going to talk about atheism and philosophy, and then questions, although you may have questions about atheists, this is a good time for questions about worldviews, because you have this course has 2 weeks focusing on worldviews. And then tomorrow will be scientific. Oh yeah, I needed to ask you this morning, for our special topic, if you have an opinion, write it on a piece of paper, and just put it up here on the pulpit, or slip it to me. Write the topic. If you are a credit student, put a star by it. That means I will pay attention to it. No, it means you get extra weight, but anyone else can weigh in. But it's something that you would like to see addressed. You know, and it's the reason I say the star, because you might want to see something addressed that they actually already spent a week on back in October. And the vast majority of the students for this session are not even in the room right now. They're in other places, or they're in other years watching this right now. So please get that to me before I go today, because I like to have that prepared before I show up tomorrow. And then, so question session. I'll be teaching tonight, campus ministry. Tomorrow is called, what's that, Glenn? parents, teens and parents. Just the teens. And then I got a couple more things on Sunday. But it's going to be fun. So let's get right into it. We had our detour. Now we're back. We're back. Cultural contradictions in the Bible. How many of you think the Bible is error-free? Error-free. There's not a single incorrect thing in the whole Bible. Okay? The minority put their hands up. What that means is to be determined. How many of you have had non-Christians say they can't believe in the Bible because of, and then they mention some contradiction? Does that happen? You know, if you never share your faith, it will probably never happen. You share your faith, it happens, well, like every week. And if you're working with youth, it's more like every day. So I think it's an important area of apologetics. Peter tells us to be ready. It's not just to proclaim the gospel with the right attitude, but also to defend. It's not enough just to teach the truth. We have to be able to refute error. If you were fencing, and I don't fence, my son used to, it's not enough just to, you block him so he doesn't get points. You actually want to get through. All right, and touche. So what about chronology? Now, in this session, because it's being recorded, you might just hold back. I'm going to just tell myself it's not being recorded. I'll just be very uninhibited. What kinds of problems do we have with chronology? We've got Jesus. The Christian world believes he was crucified on Good Friday. But there's some people, a small minority, who think he was crucified on Thursday because they can't imagine how 3 days and 3 nights would work if you're checking in Friday, checking out Sunday morning. That seems like a problem. You have the chronology in the Gospels. One thing I did in my second year as a Christian, and I took a summer and I went through the Gospels, especially the Synoptic Gospels, and I compared the sequences of events in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and I saw a number of dislocations. So Matthew, the events go here, 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 and then in Luke, instead of here, 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 that one's moved to be before the one there. And did that happen before and after? Or did Luke move the material around? Chronologies of the gospel. Some people are uncomfortable with, like, the cleansing of the temple, because in John it's chapter 2, in the Synoptics it's in the end. And they say, well, he must have cleansed it twice. And then usually there's a probability argument. They would have come back. They would have set up shop again. Is that really valid? We got genealogies in the Bible. We have, and some uncertainty whether names represent persons or nations, and what is actually the purpose of these genealogies? When is the beginning anyway? In the beginning God created. What about that kind of chronology? There are all kinds of questions and problems. What year did the king actually come to the throne? When you go through Kings and Chronicles, in the 8th year of this king of Judah, this king became king in Israel, and you've got channel 1 and channel 2 back and forth. Sometimes the years don't match up. Though if you understand they're using 2 different counting systems, the problem evaporates. If you understand the genealogies are not meant to give us every step, but to establish a connection, to make a point, those problems evaporate. If we look at the order of events in the gospel and realize that an ancient biography, that's called bios, or vita in Latin, like Plutarch's Lives, if we understand that they had a different approach to chronology. Which gospel is Peter's gospel? Mark. Now there's something written at the end of the 2nd century called Gospel of Peter, which has a really jazzy account of the crucifixion, the resurrection, and hell, and it's not biblical. It's not terrible, but it's not in the Bible. But the Gospel of Peter, according to Papias, is Mark. Peter died under Nero. Nero died in 68, right? So Peter died in the 60s, maybe in 64, when the persecution started. Papias is writing at the beginning of the 2nd century. And he tells us that Mark accompanied Peter and wrote down things. And he made a narrative out of it. He wrote down the things Peter did and said, but not in order. Because in the ancient world, unlike today, they didn't feel the need to put everything in the exact order. Sometimes they preferred to group like things together. You understand this in a way, particularly with film. We have a lot of backflashes. And it can be confusing if you don't know what's going on. When you realize, okay, we're going back and forth. Here he's a boy. Here he's a full-grown man. We're going back and forth. But the way they did that with literature is, it's surprising to most Bible readers who are taught that things happen literally as they appear, one after another, just like that. And so what I'm saying is a lot of the problems and contradictions are caused not by the Bible, but by the church. Church causes problems. What else did I mention on Numbers? Did I mention the counting? I mentioned when did Jesus die? Let's come to that in a second. On Numbers themselves, when they were copied, there were frequently mistakes, especially in the Old Testament. Dozens of errors the copyist made, so that sometimes we don't even really know what the number was. Among the Jews in Israel, they used the Hebrew alphabet, or I should call that the Hebrew syllabary, because really it's 22 consonants, not vowels. They used that for numbers. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That's Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Dalet, Hey. So they used numbers. Now, if you've seen Hebrew letters, a lot of them look the same. Like He and Het are almost identical. Wav and Yod are very similar. You just lengthen the Yod a slight bit. You've changed a Y into a W. It's better having numerals. But the Hebrews people used letters, and so did the Greeks. Look, alpha, beta, gamma, delta, epsilon, d gamma, zeta, eta, theta, iota, kappa, lambda. See, when you get up to 10, then the next letter is 20, up to 90, the next letter is 100, then 200. You got it? So, copying numbers was challenging, partly because it looks like words, and the Bible has lots of errors there. I'm not saying the original did, but especially in books like Samuel and Kings. Beaucoup d'erreurs. The crucifixion. The first language I studied in school was Latin. I went to a really great private school that's where I graduated high school. I was there in 4th grade, and there was a kind of a cute girl, Karen, I remembered. We had moved, and then we came back to that county, and my parents wanted my brother and me to go to that school again. And we were joining very late. I remember being in the principal's office. This is a good thing, principal's office. And it was like, what classes am I going to take? He said, well, we're going to definitely put you in Algebra 1 because you've been bored the last 2 years, it looks like. And they said, you might consider Latin. I said, well, what's it required? He said, 90 minutes a day of homework. I said, I think I'll let that go. And he was talking to my parents, and I noticed in the list of who was taking it, I saw Karen's name in there. She was really cute, back in 4th grade. Now, sometimes they're cute in 4th grade, and by the time you get to 10th grade or 12th grade, you hardly recognize them. But the Lord looks at the heart. But anyway, that was the hook. So I said, put me in Latin. The first year is grammar. 2nd year was Caesar. 3rd year is Cicero. 4th year is Virgil. least that's the classical. And I had a fifth year when I was in grad school at Harvard. It was the Cicero year. It was the ninth grade. We're translating the letters of Cicero. And he would date his letters. This, he's writing on the fifth day after the calends of November. The calends is the first day. What's the fifth day after the calends? Tell me. Go ahead. Well, we would say the sixth. They said first, second, third, fourth, fifth. The fifth day after the calends is the fifth. If I visited your home and stayed at your place on Thursday and maybe I left it Friday, we had a cup of coffee together. Bye. It's been great having the last 2 days together. You might think, well, it was hardly a few hours. The ancient world didn't count that way. It counted more the way children count, inclusive reckoning. You count the first and the last. And then sometimes they even double count. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I'm not trying to put them down. I'm just telling you, inclusive reckoning was standard in the ancient world. Yeah, but he says 3 days and 3 nights. Well, a day and a night, or a night and a day, means a day. No, it means what it says. It means 3 days and 3 nights. Yes, it would today. You're not going to argue at checkout in your hotel what it means, 3 nights in a hotel. But in the ancient world, if you were in the tomb Friday to Sunday, that's 3 days and 3 nights. And you just have to get used to that, though it may feel strange. That's 2,000 years ago. What right do we have to say, no, they must conform with my thinking? They've got to do it my way. Well, God did it their way. I mean, God's whole word is brought down and accommodated to the level of the original audience. It still affects us, but we have to dig into the past a bit. Well, that's the first area, chronology, time. Actually, we actually did 2, because I accidentally covered most of what I had to say about numbers, but who cares? What do you guys think? Is there a question about? Because I actually have 12. This is number 1. Go ahead, Don.
That eliminates a lot of questions and struggles that people have.
That eliminates a lot of questions and struggles people have.
Yeah, I think you put that well about who it was written to and their understanding and their interpretation. We can't foist our culture and our modern understanding on theirs.
We shouldn't force our modern understanding or force our culture on them. It's so true. When I studied Swedish, a lot of times when you do another language, the hard thing is the prepositions. And I would get into playful arguments with my Swedish teacher. You don't do this at the other person, you do it for the other person. He said, no, this is the preposition we use. Well, that says, now you're saying it's on the table, but you've got to learn the prepositions the way we do it. It's good, yeah.
So I've had people say to me before, when I've tried to explain this, you got to look at your audience and your context, decide how you're going to read some of this text, and then they will say something like, well, if I can't take this literally, then what in the Bible can I take?
So sometimes that's a good point. People react when you say you really need to kind of enter their world and understand it as as the Lord intended them to understand it. People can come back and say, oh, well, then you're not taking it literally. So I would say to a third party, that's just silly. To those people, I would say, wait a minute, we do this all the time. And when we teach history in schools. We kind of make it our story. We learn lessons from it. And what do you mean by the word literally anyway? The Bible is probably 1/3 non-literal. It's got apocalyptic. It's got a ton of poetry, at least 30%, 35%. And when you start trying to take all poetry literally, it's crazy. So you could ask her, so you take all poems literally? What's your favorite poem? She probably has one. Go ahead, give me a verse. Give me a stanza. So you take that literally? Well, no. Oh, then it's meaningless. No, it's not meaningless. Yes, it is. It's not literal. Who knows what it can mean? It's just your guess is as good as mine. That's true in the nature of some poetry. One's guess is as good as another. But the truth is, poetry and fiction can be equally valuable vehicles of truth. Okay, and wait, weren't you before? That wasn't his question, that was more his comment.
I think you talked before about face value, the idea of taking something at face value.
I like the phrase face value.
And I wondered if you could comment on that as far as literal versus
Yeah. Yeah, I say I don't take things literally. I don't take things, I mean, what would I say? I probably say I take things literarily. I look for, to understand something in the Bible, you have to identify the part of the Bible, what kind of literature that is. Are you reading from a poem? Is it a proverb? Proverbs are generalized truths, so don't say they're true in every case. Poem, whoa, careful. Oh, now that's a narrative. That's a bit different. Oh, here's a narrative told in a poetic way. Ooh, we'll come to that in a moment. So I still like face value, but people say, well, face value, the obvious value, is literal. Now, in the last 2,000 years, loads of educated men and women have routinely taken parts of the Bible figuratively that some of us might not. I mean, I'd say probably educated Christians and Jews have not very often taken Genesis 1 literally. That's not a modern thing. It has nothing to do with the evolution controversy. In fact, as the centuries wore on, more and more people allegorized and spiritualized the text. So, yeah, I still like face value, but if I can explain, that means we have to identify the genre. And that's at the heart of the subject of biblical interpretation. What's the genre?
trees clap their hands.
Say?
So when the trees clap their hands,
Let the trees clap their hands, right. You know, face value, wow, I guess the trees were animated back then, and like in The Wizard of Oz, they had faces and they could grab people. Or like the Ents in Tolkien, they could go a long distance and uproot their root balls. Poetry versus prose. He'll shield you under his wings. Psalm 91:4. The arm of the Lord is not too short. Okay, so his arms, you would think he only had one, except in Deuteronomy, you have the everlasting arms. So he has at least two arms and wings. Are the arms above the wings or underneath his wings? And the eye of the Lord goes everywhere. So is it on a stalk and rotating? See, when we literalize things that are otherwise clear, we end in nonsense. I mentioned yesterday, does God have a throne? Let's approach the throne of mercy, to find, or grace, to find mercy in our time of need. Yes, he has a throne in that respect. He has a throne in that he's the king. Does he have a throne? No, of course not. He fills the entire universe. Right? We talked about gender yesterday. Is God masculine? His maleness is simply an analogy. He's not actually male or female. It's a wrong approach. Anyway, poetry, I think, enriches the Bible tremendously. If the whole thing was written in prose, especially if it was all in prose without any figure of speech, how would you like to read it? How does that read? Oh, I mean, you can read it, but give us some variety. And besides, a lot of things penetrate the heart more easily through pictures and images than they do with straight propositions. Kind of like the difference between classical and cultural apologetics. Well, the Bible contradicts itself. The Old Testament has 18 death penalties, something like that. But then Jesus tells you not to kill, not even to kill your enemy. They had soldiers back then, but then Jesus contradicted that and rebuked Peter for taking out his sword. Contradiction. Well, is it contradiction or is it a difference between the covenants? In the Old Covenant, the church was the state. the church had the sword. Murder was still a sin. On the rare time when Israel had military encounters, there was killing. And some people were executed. In the New Testament, the church doesn't even have a sword. So in a way, the discussion is silly from the beginning. But private individuals are told by Jesus to love your enemy and actually to feed them. Well, he's just being figurative. Yeah, really? Yeah, feed them in your heart. Pray for them in your heart. You can still kill them if you do so lovingly. Really? Paul said, feed him if he's hungry. Now, you tell me a single battle on this planet raging today where a soldier goes behind the enemy lines with a picnic basket because he thought those guys were getting hungry, and besides, we captured your water source. What would happen to him? I mean, a lot of armies, they just shoot him on the spot. You can't give aid and succor to the enemy, right? So it's a false comparison. The new covenant, we're in God's kingdom. We're living in the old order, but God's kingdom has already begun. We're living in this overlap of ages, and there are things that we just don't do anymore. In the Messianic kingdom, the plowshare is beaten into a sword. No, the opposite. The sword is beaten into a plowshare. An instrument of war becomes an instrument of peace. And there's so many things like that. Oh, they killed animals, but where's that in the New Testament? You forgot it. Jesus is the sacrifice. Well, it's not a contradiction. One is a progression, or one fulfills the other. Does that make sense? Any questions about that? It ties into number 4, but any questions about that? Progressive revelation means that not that earlier revelation was incorrect, but that built on that, the truth is revealed more and more. It builds upon itself. We have a better and better understanding of what goes on. I mean, an easy example would be Satan. Okay, where's Satan in the Bible? Where's the first place? Garden of Eden. Although you wouldn't necessarily know that from reading Genesis, unless someone told you. Just a snake, right? Job. He's in Job. Where else? Looks like he might be in Zechariah. He's in 1 Chronicles 21. But he's hardly anywhere. Now, in the period between the Testaments, the Jewish people speculated like crazy. They absorbed ideas. They're thinking about the demonic developed. Did God use that? I don't know. But by the New Testament times, Satan he's far more than just an accuser, a fault finder, a district attorney for the heavenly court. He's the evil one. It's not that the Old Testament's wrong, it's just incomplete. So there's a clearer and clearer picture of who he is. Back to school. So I took algebra. I was one of those guys who asked a lot of questions in class, and I also like to make the class laugh, usually by doing stupid things. But I really did want to learn. There are things in algebra that it would have been handy if we had learned Algebra 2 at the same time. But we didn't. Did my teacher deceive me? No, they knew that for most kids, just getting the idea of, it's somewhat abstract. Algebra, it's a little abstract at the beginning. I struggled with it until the middle of the year. I was doing lousy and getting 60s. By the end of the year, I was at 100. I needed a lot of time. But then there was the geometry year. Then there's the Algebra 2 year. Then there was trigonometry and analytical geometry. 11th grade was integral. 12th grade was differential calc. College was vector calc, tensor products, all that cool stuff. Now, would you ever say your teacher was deceptive, because he held back something. Example I use a lot when I teach about science is when I was 7, I asked my teacher, can you take a big number away from a number that's smaller, like 7 take away 8? She said no. So I asked my father. I didn't know it at the time, but my father had been a math major. He was an actuary. I said, what happens? Can you do it? He said, yeah, you can take a big number away from a small number. What do you get? He said a negative number. Oh, okay. But there wasn't a lot of explanation. I misheard. Those first 8 years of my life lived in Florida. Where I was, a lot of people, if you weren't wearing any clothes, you were naked. I thought my father had said, you get a naked number. So I thought, I'm not going to talk about that anymore. A few years later, I learned, actually, it's okay, and it's a -5 or a negative. It's not naked. It's not naked. But see, you got to deal with people where they are. No, it's easy for us to say, oh yeah, those Jews in the early, they're not very advanced. Yeah, sure. The truth is, we're not very advanced. If humans are on the planet another 2 centuries, they'll be laughing about us for how backward we were. But compared to God's knowledge, I mean, he's the greatest mathematician, right? It's really no comparison. It's about getting a point across, getting truth across. Anyway, I find that's helpful because you may not like this next one. The law of Moses. Where is it? Well, the legal material proper is mainly in Exodus and following. So you have the 10 Commandments in Exodus 20. You have a similar 10 Commandments in Deuteronomy 5. You have very different 10 Commandments in Exodus 34. My Exodus book comes out in 3 weeks. I hope you'll get it. Ponder this further. Exodus seems to be dealing with the desert situation. People are living in tents. Deuteronomy assumes that people are celebrating feast, for example, in houses. Deuteronomy is an update of Exodus for the new generation, but also for a new situation. And some of the laws are updated, expanded, kind of like adding amendments to the Constitution. Well, the Bill of Rights, adding amendments to the Bill of Rights. You say, well, that's deceitful. They should have done it all. Who has the right to change it? Well, God. It's like progressive revelation, but things can be shaped, adapted for new times. Now, you can see this is a very powerful tool for good, but it could be a powerful tool for evil. Oh, good. It's plastic. I can squeeze the Bible any way I want to get what I want. If we're mature and we love God, we won't fall into that trap. But a lot of times, parallel passages don't match for that very reason. Numbers I've already mentioned. Keep in mind that also frequently there are approximations. Pentecost. How many people are immersed in water? Yeah, and it doesn't even say about 3,000. It says 3,000. The Bible says what it means. So it has to be 3,000. Well, couldn't it be a round number? I mean, aren't the chances pretty good that it's... the last digit, let's be analytical, there's 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, and there's 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So it's 50-50 that thing would end on a 0. So it could be, and a 10% chance it would land on a 0. I want you to think about that. Because I don't think it's a literal number. Worse, I don't think he's even talking, I think it was a lot more than 3,000 because it's not counting any women. They never count the women. Women are not counted. Jesus fed the 5,000, not counting men and children. Certainly hope in your church you don't count women and children in your attendance figures. That's fudging. I'm kidding. Although I came back from a 7-nation African tour recently. A lot of the churches there, I asked them, the ushers count children? No. They count them because sometimes people in the U.S. want to know, but we don't use that in our stats. It's not meaningful. We only count adults. And I'm not advising, in case you wonder, should they only count men? But it would be quite interesting if for a year your church only counted males. It would reveal a lot, don't you think? It would reveal something. So we have approximations, but sometimes there are errors. I think the errors are typically in copying. Paraphrase. It's not a translation. The message is not a Bible. It's not a Bible translation. So if the wording contradicts something else, it's not a real contradiction because it's not a translation. The New Living Bible was a paraphrase. The New Living Translation attempted to be more thorough, but it's still paraphrase. I'll give you an example. I used to be Episcopalian, but since I've been in the Church of Christ for 40 years, there are 10 or 20 passages that people in our movement kind of pay close attention to. I know what Acts 2:38 says. I hope you know, because Peter just finished preaching his Pentecost sermon, and the people are cut to the heart in 37 and 38. What does it say? Repent and be baptized? No. What does it say? You're saying that you think Peter spoke English? No. Kai Petros metanoesiste ke baptisteto hekasto simone betonomatu Jesu Christe esten afesen toramation himon kai lemsiste tondorantu pneumatus to hiu. That's what he said. See, we already have an issue with interpretation because we're not reading it. See, you have to either learn the language of the Bible or you have to trust someone else to do it for you. That's a level of interpretation that happens for most of us before we even start reading. Most Bibles say, and be baptized for the forgiveness of sins, or unto the forgiveness of sins. The Living Bible said, to show that your sins are forgiven. NLT came out in 96, I think. I bought it, read the whole thing. That was pretty good. And they actually corrected that. They just left it for the forgiveness of sins. The historic position of the church until at least the 1500s. But then the new version, in the new millennium, went back to the old thing. I think they took heat for having a high view of baptism. So they went back to show you're already saved. Can you see what's going on? Is there a contradiction? Well, certainly not when you're dealing with the originals. But versions frequently contradict themselves, particularly when they're not translating, but they're paraphrasing. They're paraphrastic. Now, here's a great example of false contradiction. 150 years ago, the Bible is full of fluff. Keeps talking about those Hittites dozens of times, and there are no Hittites. We've not found anything. They're even digging now over there. And in the late 1800s, they started finding cities and hundreds and then thousands of Hittite plates and their language. They had their own form of hieroglyphics, in fact. And I'm thinking maybe my next time in Turkey, I'd like to go to the old Hittite capital. But this Hittites, it's huge. My colleague in teaching in AIM, Joey Harris, is from University of Pennsylvania, where they have a master's degree in Hittite language, if you want to get it. If you want to get the PhD, though, you have to go to University of Chicago. This is for the empire that never was. Israel Finkelstein, that's how he says it, he's excavating Megiddo, or Armageddon. It's well worth seeing when you go to Israel. He's what is called a minimalist. He kind of minimizes every discovery. He believes very little of the Bible. He thinks everything about David and Solomon is just legendary. So in 1993, when the David tablet was discovered, by the team of Avraham Bihran in Tel Dan. They're excavating Dan, and the team found a plaque. You know, David died. When did David die? And he lived around 1,000. Probably died around 970. This is written by the Syrians, the enemies, the Arameans, the enemies of Israel. It mentions the house of David. So it's from an enemy. Now that's in a way better than testimony from a friendly, because even the enemy admits this. It was found in Tel Dan, and it dates to the 8th century or 9th century. I'm trying to remember the date. You probably don't care. Truth is, I don't really care. But it's like 150 years later. Finkelstein says, well, you know, it's probably a different David. You know, there's still no evidence for David. Yeah, in the last 2 years, Eilat Mazar, she's the daughter of Benjamin Mazar. After 1967, the Six-Day War, with the change in political boundaries, the Israelis started excavating the Temple Mount. Benjamin Mazar was the guy. So anyway, I know a lot of their family members. A few years ago, excavating the city of David, they found a pomegranate. Okay, they found a bell. 2 visits ago, I was asking one of the rabbis, who's an archaeologist, anything cool? Well, one of our guys found a bell in the sewer. It looks like the bell that would have been on the high priest's garment. And then last year, looks like they found David's palace. Well, what's the point? I could give you 10 or 20, and if you're a regular student, you already listened to the archaeology podcast? You've already done those. They have the Old Testament, New Testament, so you're kind of up to date, although you're not really. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Just because you can't prove something now doesn't mean that it didn't happen. Lack of historical attestation. Does that make sense?